Given everything happening around the Strait of Hormuz and the broader oil market, I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective and walking our audience through what matters most right now. So let's jump right in. To start broadly, how much longer do you think the Strait of Hormuz could remain closed? And from your perspective, is the situation getting better or worse?
Yeah, sure. So our expectation here is that we're looking for this to potentially extend into April. And so it's been closed for a few weeks already for the most part, and we expect that to continue for the next few weeks. In terms of getting better or worse, it is getting better from the perspective that we're starting to see more cargoes, more tankers passing through, but it's a very small number. And
Mhm.
so maybe last week we were seeing just one or two, now we're sort of seeing three or four. But in the grand scheme of things, it's still basically closed. It's not really improving, it's just a very gradual improvement there. Now, in terms of getting worse, we are seeing producers in the region having to shut in their production
Mhm.
simply because they cannot get their exports or their tankers out of the Mideast Gulf. And so we have the likes of Iraq that is shutting in production, UAE, Kuwait. You've got Qatar has already shut in its LNG. That happened sort of immediately in the aftermath of Iran started to be bombing. Even Saudi Arabia has been cutting in production. And so yes, the situation is still very much deteriorating, even though it's kind of at a very much a standstill from an export perspective.
Sounds good. And that's really helpful context. And of course, when people hear about disruption in the scale, the next question is what it means in practical terms. So, what could this mean for oil prices from here? And ultimately, how quickly might that feed through to prices at the pump in the US?
Absolutely. So, in terms of oil prices, currently we're around $100 here. It is already feeding into prices at the pump. That happened almost immediately, in that in late February, WTI, that US oil benchmark, was about $65. Now, as mentioned, it's close to $100. And so that percentage increase is being reflected through into prices at the pump. So currently today we're at about $3.70. Back in late February, we were about $3 or under that. And so it is quickly getting priced into prices at the pump. And this is the worst case scenario for President Trump because he has the midterm elections coming up at the end of this year. He uses prices at the pump essentially as an inflation tool to try and keep inflation in check. It is also a way to appeal to his base because if he can keep prices of the pump down, it means there's more money in the pockets of middle America, essentially. The flip side of that is that as oil prices are rising, we are seeing prices of the pump rising. The majority of Americans are driving around in their car, and every 2, 3 miles, you see a gas station. And at that gas station, you see a billboard that tells you what the price of gas is. When that price is low, you feel pretty good about yourself. When that price is high, you have anxiety, and that also gets reflected through into your view of the government. And so those higher prices are definitely going to be having a detrimental impact on the popularity of President Trump here. And so if we see oil prices pushing on, if our expectation is the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for another 2 weeks into April, then prices of the pump are going to grind higher. They're going to surpass $4 a gallon on the national average and pushing on from there. When we look at the price of diesel, we have already seen that increasing at a greater pace, and diesel on the national average is above $5 a gallon here now. And so that is going to be reflected into the price of goods, in the price of trucking to move these goods. And so it's already having an impact, and it will continue to have an impact the longer that the Strait of Hormuz is closed.
So that market impact consumers are watching most closely. I want to shift now from pricing to physical infrastructure because that's obviously a major part of the story too. So from what you're seeing in the data, what does your data suggest regarding the physical integrity of Carg Island's loading infrastructure following the recent strikes?
Yeah, so I was just looking at the numbers just before this interview, and we have seen a loading yesterday. We saw a couple of loadings over the weekend, and so Carg Island was attacked over the weekend there. But we have still seen export loading. So the infrastructure on the oil side of things doesn't look to have been impacted, is what President Trump told us. At the same time, too, we were not expecting him to target that oil infrastructure. I know he is making threats about it, but what happens is if you take out Kharg Island, you take out the vast majority of Iranian crude exports, what that means, if you think of global supply, that is going to get cut. And that's the last thing he wants to do at a time when we're already seeing producers elsewhere cutting production. And so that would cause prices to rally even harder. The other thing to bear in mind is that through the Strait of Hormuz, the majority of the crude that we are seeing passing through there, or the majority of the tankers, are Iranian crude. And so those barrels are still making their way to market, and they head to China as well, which is the largest importer of crude in the world. And so President Trump does not want to be cutting those flows, we don't believe, simply because of the bullish impacts it would have on oil prices.
And that's really helpful. So if that infrastructure remains impaired, then the obvious next question is where replacement barrels could realistically come from and how fast. So with the roughly 8 million barrels a day offline, how much of that gap can realistically be filled by the Permian and Guyana over the next 90 days?
Very little can be filled by
Mhm.
Guyana and the Permian. There's really no producer that can
Mhm.
really ramp up production. The biggest swing producer in the world is Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is cutting production here. You know, the Middle East producers are the ones that have the ability to increase production and cut it back, and so there's no natural replacement. Now, we could see US production increasing in the coming months here because of higher oil prices. This is absolutely a great situation for US oil producers because they are able to hedge their production, guarantee production at higher prices into the future here. But that is only going to be a very small incremental increase. So whether, you know, 1, 200, 300,000 barrels a day, perhaps. So that's a drop in the bucket compared to the losses that we're seeing. In terms of other producers and exporters, Latin America has been that key region in terms of non-OPEC supply growth in recent years, but Guyana hasn't got another crude stream coming online until later this year. Brazil is seeing near record production, near record exports, but again, they're very incremental barrels that they can add to the market here, a very small amount. And so there is really no solution to backfill the loss of so much production losses from the Middle East.
And that's really important reality check. So with that in mind, when you look across the market, who is actually benefiting from the current situation, whether that's a producers, shippers, traders, or certain regions?
Yeah, so we mentioned with the US producers, they're definitely benefiting from this situation because the ability for them to hedge at a much higher price, whether it's closer to $80 a barrel now, when previously it would have been in the 50s, the high 50s there. And so they will be hedging, although the impact of that is somewhat mitigated by the fact that you have a lot of consolidation within the US producers. And so it's a lot more big players acting in the market, and there's only sort of a handful of them that are controlling that US production. So it's a very different situation to perhaps 10 years ago when there were many, many small players who may, if there's a buck a barrel to be made in terms of profit, they're going to go for it. So the US oil industry is very much less boom and bust now compared to half a decade ago. But they're one of the winners. Other obvious winner is Russia. So prior to the situation with Iran here, Russia was really feeling the pain in terms of its revenues because its oil was having to be discounted by about $20 to $25 versus a typical oil barrel, so that these countries would buy it simply because those barrels are sanctioned. And so India, China predominantly were getting an absolute bargain because they were buying this oil at a $20 discount. And so the situation has absolutely flipped on its head here, where now Russian crude is selling at a premium to a typical barrel simply because there's not a great replacement for the type of crude that is produced in the Middle East. It is a medium sour barrel. We talk about US production there. Majority of that is light sweet. It's a more high quality crude, which produces more gasoline and less diesel. An almost perfect replacement for a Middle Eastern barrel is from Russia. And so we're seeing those barrels get bid up. Not just that, but also with India. India has been granted this waiver to be able to buy Russian crude. And so we have seen a change in behavior from them. From India in recent months, they had been dialing back their purchases of Russian crude because of pressure being placed on them by the US administration. And those flows had instead headed to China. Now we're seeing a change in that where India is basically buying as many of these Russian barrels as it can. So we'll see that showing up in sort of these April deliveries here.
And that brings us to one of the key system questions here, which is whether alternative routes can really compensate in a meaningful way. So, how much spare bypass capacity is really left right now? And specifically, the Saudi East-West pipeline and the UAE's ADCOP pipeline already running close to their practical limits.
Yes, so with the Saudi East-West pipeline, we are seeing exports there about 3 million barrels per day. Prior to them redirecting those flows, that volume was about 750,000 barrels a day. We still think that can increase by another maybe 1.5 million barrels per day, so up to 4.5 million barrels a day in total there. Now we are seeing all of the tankers that typically head into the Mideast Gulf there because they are being redirected to Yanbu, the other destination of that east-west pipeline. Typically you see the majority of Saudi crude exports coming out of the Mideast Gulf there, but instead they're going to be coming out of Yanbu. So that situation for now is serving them very well. Not all of those exports are going to be able to be redirected, but for the most part, it is looking like that's going to happen. In terms of UAE, they have a pipeline as well where they can redirect those flows to Fujairah. However, the terminal there at Fujairah was hit over the weekend, and so it was hit with drone debris. Loadings have been impacted, and so that situation is somewhat more in question. As you see these attacks continuing to escalate, so you see Kharg Island being attacked, you see like a tit-for-tat response from Iran, and so Iran is now targeting, as we've seen with UAE, and so we should expect that to continue, and so the UAE flows are really in question.
And so, even with those alternatives, there are still real constraints in the system. And that leads naturally to the question of whether barrels are beginning to back up elsewhere. So, is global floating storage building because barrels are effectively trapped inside, or at least constrained by conditions around the Strait of Hormuz right now?
Yes, they are. So we're seeing floating storage at about 140 million barrels, but the share of that is increasing in terms of what is stuck in the Mideast Gulf there because it sat there for 7 days or longer. It then becomes floating storage. And so prior to this situation, we're seeing that floating storage about 120 million. A lot of that was Iranian crude, Russian crude, Venezuelan crude. The Iranian crude floating storage is holding up, but that makes sense because they pushed out a lot of exports prior to when the bombing started because they essentially expected military strikes. So we saw Iran pushing out a lot of exports. Those are now making their way and being sat off of China there. And so that is helping to buoy the floating storage. But we are seeing more barrels being imported into China of Iranian crude. But we've seen Russian floating storage starting to drop because as soon as the bombing started on Iran, India brought those cargoes on shore. So the short answer is yes, we're seeing floating storage building, and yes, it's in the Middle East.
And I want to close by zooming out to the demand side, and which we just slightly mentioned, but because two countries everyone is watching very closely here are China and India. So China and India are obviously two key players in the global oil market, and both are highly exposed to developments in the Middle East. So how are they faring right now?
Right. So with India, India is really struggling. In refinery runs are about 5 million barrels a day. It imports about 5 million barrels a day of oil. Nearly half of that is coming from the Middle East, and those flows are essentially grinding to a halt. But it has now got this waiver, so it's able to backfill some of it, but not all of it, from Russia. And so we'll be seeing that over the coming weeks here. That said, their imports on the aggregate are going to have to drop because they just can't replace all of that Middle Eastern crude, and so they will be dialing back on their refinery runs, it would seem. When we talk about China, China is the largest importer of crude in the world, about 11 million barrels per day. About 45% of that, 5 million barrels a day, is coming from the Middle East. And so while we still see those Iranian crude barrels being discharged, we're gradually going to see those Middle East imports dropping off because they've been halted from essentially flowing. And so China does have the added ability to draw from storage. It has over 1.2 billion barrels there, but they are not going to want to draw down their war chest, right? And so we expect that they are also going to be cutting refinery runs. And so it's a common theme across Asia that we're seeing exports of products being banned, and also the likelihood of refinery runs being cut simply because they do not have the availability of crude, because the Middle East essentially sends 90% of its barrels into Asia. So overall here, not a great situation, and one that is continuing to deteriorate every single day.
Wow, thank you so much, Matt. And thank you again for joining us. So, this has been a really valuable conversation, and I appreciate how clearly you've helped us understand both the physical market dynamics and the broader global implications. So, thanks so much for sharing your time and insights with us today. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. We'll see you next time on BERYL Elites.
Thank you.